It's a pleasure to be with all of you today, and especially to talk about this topic that I believe is so timely for the time that we're living right now, and especially for the students that we're serving across the higher education sector. A lot of what I'm going to share today is information that I published in an article for AAC&U's publication, Liberal Education, back in 2018. And when I was preparing my remarks for today, and I pulled up that article, it struck me that so much of what we had written then is still true today. And I'm going to begin with just an opening statement. In the work that I do today, in the work with the Aspen Institute and across community colleges that I support and coach today, one of the things that we've been incredibly focused on is on student outcomes. And when we talk about student outcomes, we're focused primarily on completion, but then we're also beginning to look at what post-graduation outcomes look like. At the Aspen Institute, we call this College 3.0, where College 1.0 was all about access in the community college sector. 2.0 was looking at just getting the students to completion. But really today, when we talk about transformational institutions, we're looking at those that focus on 3.0, which is what happens after graduation. And the thought that community colleges and universities alike have a critical role to play, not just in getting the student to a credential, but to impacting what happens to the student post-completion. And so when we focus on what we do within the institution, we're always looking to provide an education that gives the students the skills that they need so that when they do graduate, they can obtain and thrive in good jobs. And that's especially important today when we're striving as a sector to ensure that every American has a job that leads to social and economic mobility. And so it's a critical goal for us to ensure that students have those skills, that they've got the ability to do the things that employers want them to do in the jobs. But it's not enough and it's not sufficient. And what I would argue is that we also need a way to be able to understand what more students need in order to thrive in our society today. When we look at what's going on in our country today, we've reached a crisis point in our nation. And this crisis point is caused in many ways by our collective inability to engage in effective and civil discourse that leads to healing, that leads to solutions that can help move us forward. We've reached a point where we're unable to have a lively debate where we exchange ideas, where we can agree to disagree in a civil way, but be able to put forth our arguments, our rationale, our concerns, the way that we view the world, and the way that we think we can come up with collective solutions in a way that allows us to have a healthy exchange of ideas, that allows us to reach consensus and move forward. We've become divided in many ways, but the most challenging aspect is that we've become divided in the way that we approach our conversations, in the way that we are able to have dialogue, which right now has been lost to the world of social media. And so rather than engage in a discussion face-to-face with someone, we take to the social media airwaves and post comments that sometimes are responded to, sometimes are not, and sometimes just result in loss of contact with someone altogether. And so the role that higher education plays is really important in this piece. We have for decades and centuries, I would argue, have had a central role in helping to educate our future citizens in how to have this civil discourse, how to have debate in a way where we can exchange ideas and be able to come up with solutions that benefit all individuals concerned. For colleges and universities, especially those that enroll high numbers of minoritized and historically underserved populations, we need to find ways that allow us to help each student find their voice. Many of the students that come to our institutions are first in their families to enroll in an institution. Many of them are first-generation Americans in many cases. Many of them have never had the opportunity to be able to engage in any sort of civil engagement opportunities within their communities. And many of them have never really had to exercise their voice in terms of issuing forth their opinions and their arguments and their thoughts and their beliefs. But more important than finding their voice is also projecting their voice and giving students the opportunity to be able to utilize that voice to be able to drive change for themselves, for their families, but most importantly for their communities. And if we expand that further and further for their cities, for their state, and eventually for our nation. The goal that we should all have as educators in the post-secondary sector is to really help students find their place and position in our society to be able to advance good for themselves and good for others all around our communities as well as our nation. So the question then becomes, how do we do this? How can institutions help students find that voice, utilize that voice, and most importantly, utilize that voice for change and for change that results in the betterment of American society? And the answer to this question, as you'll hear throughout this forum today, tomorrow, and in the forums to come over this academic year, you'll hear us talk a lot about an applied learning environment. These applied learning environments are the environments that are going to allow students to break out of this cycle of silence, the cycle of what they feel as almost like an inability to be able to create change. And the way that we create this applied learning environment is by transforming classrooms into small laboratories for change making, allowing the students to exercise their voice within the classroom, through faculty who help to engage them in the community to then exercise that voice outside the classroom and slowly begin to make change in their classroom, in their campus community, and in their surrounding community. An opportunity to help them build that muscle so that when they do leave our doors and graduate and go out into the workforce, but more importantly, into our society, they know that they can use the skills that they've obtained, not only to get a good job, to move themselves and their family forward, but also that they can use the skills that they've obtained in order to be able to create change and change for good within their communities. And that's what change making at the end of the day is all about. How do we create change that results in the betterment of the places where we live? So civic and education efforts have a common foundation across all efforts. And when we look across different institutions, I would say that the first common foundation for an effective civic education program is that it be founded on the belief that all students, and I would even venture to say that a better word than all would be each, that each student can be a change maker in and of themselves without exceptions. So that should be an expectation of all programs that we have within our purview as we begin to think of effective civic education programs at colleges and universities. And then second, which goes back to what I just said about creating these small change-making laboratories in the classroom, is to ensure that students have the ability to build those key change-making skills and mindsets, not just in select courses and disciplines, not just the usual suspects of history and government and other civic related courses, but that all disciplines within the institution, whether they be in the arts, humanities, the sciences, mathematics, that students have the opportunity in each of those disciplines and classes to be able to exercise this change-making mindset and be able to drive change. So for the last few minutes of my time with you today, what I'd like to do is just give you some examples of how this was manifested at my prior institution at Miami-Dade College, where we had civic engagement and change-making opportunities available for students. And all of these activities were housed in a number of different divisions and departments on campus. And in about 2017, 2018, we brought all of these initiatives under the umbrella of change-making initiatives at the institution. But the first and probably the oldest of the initiatives that we had on campus was what became known as the Institute for Civic Engagement and Democracy. And this was established over 15 years ago at Miami-Dade College with a mission to transform learning, to strengthen democracy, and to contribute meaningfully to the common good by awakening and empowering students for lifelong engagement. And at the time that the Institute, which was abbreviated ICED, was formed, the outcomes for that program were very strongly linked to the learning outcomes that we had developed at Miami-Dade College that were expectations of learning for every student who graduated from our doors. And those outcomes were based and very strongly influenced by the LEAP outcomes that had been developed by AAC&U through collaboration with surveys and input from employers and educators in terms of the lifelong skills that students needed in order to be effective, not only in their workplace, but also in terms of being effective citizens in our community and in our society. So ICED, structured with those learning outcomes in mind and with its mission to strengthen democracy and to really contribute to the common good, they designed a myriad of curricular and co-curricular civic engagement initiatives that built some of these essential civic and workforce readiness skills and mindsets within our students. Over 7,000 students participated annually, and anywhere between 250 and 500 faculty were actually active in ICED initiatives every year at the institution. Their efforts included some traditional service learning models, but it was also coupled with very strong civic engagement efforts. And then more recently, approximately 5 years ago, the college began to form what were called impact networks. And these were committees across each of the campuses that comprised Miami-Dade College that included faculty, staff, and students with the goal of creating change within the communities that the campuses served. For context, Miami-Dade College is one of the largest institutions of higher education in the country, and over 90% of the students are students from minoritized and historically underserved backgrounds. In addition to that, the great majority of students were students who were on Pell Grants and socioeconomically disadvantaged. So the goal of the Impact Network was really to help bring these students together with the guidance of faculty and staff to really identify ways that they could create change within their communities. And so the goal was really to create this broader network where students were engaged to succeed not just in the classroom, but also within their communities. And the network was tasked with designing, developing, and supporting change-making initiatives that would span the curricular and co-curricular domains, again, engaging all disciplines, not just the common ones that we would typically see in these efforts. Students would then apply the education that they were learning, that they were attaining within their classrooms in order to address some real-world challenges that were occurring within the communities and using those skills to make a difference in their jobs and within their own families and neighborhoods across the community. One of the organizing principles behind the Impact Network was also a focus on the UN Sustainable Goals. And the importance of having a framework for this was in order to ensure that what we developed was actually a framework for change making that was nonpartisan, that would allow students from any background from across the political spectrum to be able to engage in meaningful ways with each other in order to drive change within their communities. And so in terms of the outcomes of this and what this looks like in action, at the time that we had instituted the Impact Networks and had ICED running, over 60,000 volunteer hours were clocked in by the students annually. And we had a number of students receive the presidential recognition for their volunteer work and their service to their community. The civic engagement aspect of the work in ICED and in the Impact Networks resulted in over 6,000 voter registrations from among our students annually. One of the proudest moments, I think, for us at Miami-Dade College were student-led efforts to launch a voting site on campus. they had met with quite a bit of resistance from the county commission. And so one of our student leaders, I still remember her name, Rebecca Diaz, led a group of students to actually give a presentation to the Board of County Commissioners during one of their budget hearings. And they gave such a powerful statement and witness to the importance of having a voting site on campus for themselves and for their fellow students that the mayor and the county commissioners supported their vie for the voting site. And a voting site was established on two of the largest campuses of the college. And they held true to their promise that this would not be an effort that was in vain. And in the 2 weeks that early voting was allowed during that particular election cycle, over 11,000 votes were cast at the early voting sites, which was the largest number of votes cast of any college or university in Florida that housed an early voting site. A true testament to the work of the students in terms of engaging their peers to become more civically engaged. And then lastly, one of the things that has also emerged is that the change-making activities undertaken by the students within their classrooms and across the campuses has led them to really think about ways that they can address equity challenges, not just in the communities, but also on their very campus and support their fellow students to be able to be more successful. As I mentioned, one of the frameworks that was used in order to structure the impact networks was the use of the UN Sustainable Goals. And goal number 2 is to eradicate hunger. And so our students took that to heart and decided that they would start by eradicating hunger on campus. And this led to the proliferation of food pantries across the campuses, led by faculty who helped to support the students in gearing up donations, both of foodstuffs, toiletries, as well as monetary donations to help support their fellow students on campus. And so these examples are just a little bit of a primer to help sort of whet your appetite and help prime the pump in terms of thinking about the things that you could potentially do on campus to better engage your students, and based on one relatively successful model of one institution. What you'll hear over the course of the next 2 days are examples from other institutions and other organizations of how this is possible and doable across our institutions in the post-secondary sector. In a moment, I'm going to turn this over to Dawn Whitehead, who is a vice president at AAC&U in the Office of Global Citizenship. And she's going to lead what I expect is going to be a very lively discussion with a group of students from various institutions across our country, so that you can hear directly from them, from the students, how this work positively impacts themselves and their lives and has helped them do some good in their own communities. Thank you all so much. And with that, I will turn it over to Dawn.